Welcome back. Today we are reading Wildwood Chapter 2, so let's get started. Chapter 2, One City's Impassable Wilderness. As long as Prue could remember, every map she had ever seen of Portland and the surrounding countryside had been blotted with a large dark green patch in the center, stretching like a growth of moss from the northwest corner to the southwest and labeled with the mysterious initial IW. She hadn't thought to ask about it until one night before Mac was born. When she was sitting with her parents in the living room, her dad had brought home a new atlas, and they were lying in the recliner together, leafing through the pages and tracing their fingers over boundary lines and sounding out the exotic place names of far-flung countries. When they arrived at a map of Oregon, Prue pointed to the small inset map of Portland on the page and asked the question that had always confounded her. "What's the IW?" "Nothing, honey," had been her father's reply. He flipped back to the map of Russia they had been looking at moments before. With his finger, he traced a circle over the wide northeast part of the country, where the letter of the word Siberia obscured the map. There were no city names here, no networks of wandering yellow lines demarcating highways and roads, only vast puddles, all shades of green and white, and the occasional squiggly blue line linking the myriad remote lakes that peppered the landscape. There are places in the world where people just don't end up living. Maybe it's too cold, or there are too many trees, or the mountains are too steep to climb. But whatever the reason, no one has thought to build a road there, and without roads, there are no houses, and without houses, no cities. He flipped back to the map of Portland and tapped his finger against the spot where IW was written. It stands for Impassable Wilderness, and that's just what it is. "Why doesn't anyone live there?" asked Prue. All the reasons why no one lives up in those parts of Russia. When the settlers first came to the sea and started to build Portland, no one wanted to build their house there. The forest was too deep and the hills were too steep, and since there were no houses, no one thought to build a road, and without roads and houses, the places just sort of stayed that way, empty of people. The place over time just became more overgrown and inhospitable, and so, he said, it was named the Impassable Wilderness, and everybody knew to steer clear. Her father dismissively whipped his hand across the map and brought it up to gently pinch Prue's chin between his thumb and finger, bringing her face close to his, and he said, "And I don't ever want you to go in there." He playfully moved her head back and forth and smiled. "You hear me, kid?" Prue made a face and yanked her chin free. "Yeah, I hear you." They both looked back at the atlas, and Prue laid her head against her father's chest. "I'm serious," said her father. She could see his chest tightening under her cheek. So Prue knew not to go near this impassable wilderness, and she only once bothered her parents with questions about it again. She couldn't ignore it. While the downtown continued to sprout towering condominium buildings and newly minted terracotta outlet malls blooming beside the highway in the suburbs, it baffled Prue that such an impassable swath of land should go unclaimed, untouched, undeveloped, right on the edge of the city, and yet no adult ever seemed to comment on it or mention it in conversations. It seemed to not even exist in most people's minds. The only place that the impassable wilderness would crop up was among the kids at would crop up was among the kids at Prue's school, where she was a seventh grader. There was an apocryphal tale told the older students about a man, so's uncle maybe, who had wandered into the IW by mistake and had disappeared for years and years. His family over time forgot about him and continued on their lives, until one day, out of the blue, he reappeared at their doorstep. He didn't seem to have any money of the intervening years, saying only that he'd been lost in the woods for a time and that he was terribly hungry. Prue had been suspicious of the story from her first hearing. The identity of this man seemed to change from telling to telling. It was someone's father in one version, a wayward cousin in another. Also, the details shifted in each telling. A visiting high school kid told a group of Prue's rapt classmates that the individual in this version, the kid's older brother, had returned from the weird sojourn in the impassable wilderness, aged beyond belief, with a great white beard that stretched down his tattered shoes. Regardless of the questionable truth of these stories, it became clear to Prue that most of her classmates had similar conversation with their parents as she had with her father. The subject of the wilderness filtered into the play surreptitiously. What once was a lake of passionate lava around the 4-square court was now the impassable wilderness, and the woo beaded anyone who missed a bounce and was forced to scurry away from the red rubbed ball into those wilds. In games of tag, you were no longer tagged it, but rather designated the wild coyote of the IW. And it was your job to scamper around after the fleeing classmates, barking and growling. It was the specter of these coyotes that made Prue ask her parents a second time about the impassable wilderness. She had been awakened one night in a fright by the unmaskable sound of baying dogs. Sitting up in bed, she could hear that Mac, then 4 months old, had awakened as well and was being quietly shushed by their parents as wailed and whimpered in the he wailed and whimpered in the next room. The dog's baying was a ditched echo, but it was bone-shivering nothingness. It was a tuneless melody of violence and chaos, and as it grew, more dogs in the neighborhood took up the cry. Prue noticed then that the distant barking was different from the barking of the neighborhood dogs. It was more shrill, more disordered and angry. She threw her blanket aside and walked into her parents' room. The scene was eerie. Mac had quieted a little at this point, and he was being rocked in his mother's arms, while their parents stood at the window, staring unblinkingly out over the town at the distant western horizon, their face pale and frightened. "What's that sound?" asked Prue, walking to the side of her parents. The light of St. John's spread out before them, an array of flickering stars that stopped at the river and dissolved into blackness. Her parents started when they spoke, and her father said, "Just some old dogs howling." But farther away?" asked Prue. "That doesn't sound like dogs." Prue saw her parents share a glance, and her mother said, "In the woods, darling, there are some pretty wild animals. That's probably a pack of coyotes, wishing they could tear into someone's garbage somewhere." But not to worry about it, she smiled. The baying eventually stopped, and the neighborhood dogs calmed, and Prue's parents walked her back into her room and tucked her into bed. That had been the last time the impassable wilderness had come up, but it hadn't put Prue's curiosity to rest. She couldn't help feeling a little troubled. Her parents, normally two founts of strength and confidence, seemed strangely shaken by the noises. They seemed as leery of the place as Prue was. And so one can imagine Prue's horror when the white nest, the black plume of crows, disappeared, her baby brother and Tao, into the darkness of the impassable wilderness. The afternoon had faded nearly completely. The sun digged down low behind the hills of the wilderness, and Prue stood transfixed, slack-jawed on the edge of the bluff. A train engine trundled by below her and rolled across the railroad bridge, passing low over the bricks and metal building of the industrial waste. A breeze had picked up, and Prue shivered beneath her petticoat. She was staring at the little break in the tree lines where the crows had disappeared. It started to rain. Prue felt like someone had bored a hole in her stomach, the size of a basketball. Her brother was gone, literally captured by birds and carried to a remote, untouchable wilderness, and who only knew that what they would do to him there, and it was all her fault. The light changed from deep blue to dark gray, and the street lights slowly, one by one, began to flicker on. Night had fallen. Prue knew her vigil was hopeless. Mac would not be returning. Prue slowly turned her bike around and began walking it back up the street. How would she tell her parents? They would be devastated beyond belief. Prue would be punished. She would be grounded before for staying out late on school night, riding her bike around the neighborhood. But this punishment was certain to be like nothing she'd ever experienced. She'd lost Mac, her parents' only son, her brother. If a week of no television was the standard punishment for missing a couple curfews, she couldn't imagine what it was for losing her baby brother. She walked for several blocks in a trance. She found that she was choking back tears as in her mind's eyes she witnessed on the crow's disappearance into the woods. "Get a grip, Prue," she said aloud, wiping tears from her cheeks. "Think this through." She took a deep breath and began assembling her options in her mind, weighing each one's pros and cons. Going to the police was out. They'd undoubtedly think she was crazy. She didn't know what the police did with crazy people who came into the station ranting about murders of crows and abducted 1-year-olds, but she had her suspicions. She'd be carried off in an aromed van and thrown into some faraway asylum, subterranean cell, where she'd live out the rest of her days listening to the lamenting of her fellow inmates and trying hopelessly to convince the passing janitor that she was not crazy and that she was falsely imprisoned there. The thought of rushing home to tell her parents terrified her. Their hearts would be irretrievably broken. They had waited so long for Mac to come along. She didn't know the whole story, but understood that they'd wanted to have a second child sooner, but it just hadn't come about. They had been so happy when they found out about Mac. They had positively beamed to the entire house, had felt alive and light. No, she couldn't be the one to break this terrible news to them. She could run away. This was a legitimate option. She could jump on one of those trains going over the railroad bridge and split town and travel from city to city, doing odd jobs and telling fortunes for a living. Maybe she'd even meet a little golden retriever on the road who'd become her closest companion. They'd ramble the country together, a couple of gypsies on the run, and she'd never have to face her parents or think about her dear departed brother again. Prue stopped in the middle of the sidewalk and shook her head dolefully. "What are you thinking?" she reprimanded herself. "You're out of your mind." She took a deep breath and kept walking, pushing her bike along. A chill came over her as she realized her only option. She had to go after him. She had to go into the impassable wilderness and find him. It seemed like an unsurmounted task, but she had no choice. The rain had grown heavily and was pelting down on the sidewalk and the streets, making huge puddles, and the puddles becoming choked with flottles of dead leaves. Prue devised her plan and carefully gargling the dangers of such an adventure. The chill of the evening was draping over the rain-swept neighborhood street. It would be unsafe to attempt the trip in the dead of the night. "I'll go tomorrow," she thought, unaware that she was mumbling some of the words aloud. "Tomorrow morning, first thing. Mom and Dad wouldn't even have to know. But how to keep them from finding out?" Her heart sank as she arrived at the scene of Mac's abduction, the playground. The play structure was abandoned in the sheeting rain, and Mac's little red wagon sat on the asphalt, a head of soggy blankets sitting inside, collecting water. "That's it," said Prue, and she ran over to the wagon, kneeling down on the wet pavement, and she started to mold the sobbing blankets into the form of a swaddle baby. Standing back, she studied it. "Plausible," she said. She had started to attach the wagon to the back axle of her bike when she heard a voice call, "Hey, Prue." Prue stiffed and looked over her shoulder. Standing on the sidewalk next to the playground was a boy. Incognated in a matching rain slicker and pants. He pulled the hood back on his slicker and smiled. "It's me, Curtis," he shouted and waved. Curtis was one of Prue's classmates. He lived with his parents and his two sisters, just down the street from Prue. Their desks at school were 2 rows apart. Curtis was constantly getting into trouble with their teacher for spending school time drawing pictures of superheroes, and various scrapes with their arch enemies. His drawings obsession also tended to get him in trouble with his classmates. Since most kids had abandoned superhero drawings years before, if they hadn't abandoned drawings altogether, most kids developed their drawing talents to sketching band logos on paper bag covering their textbooks. Prue was one of those only kids who transitioned away from her superhero and fairy tale inspired rendering to drawing of birds and plants. Her classmates looked askance at her, but at least they didn't bother her. Curtis, for clinging to his bygone art form, was shunned. "Hey, Curtis," said Prue, as nonchalant as possible. "What are you doing?" He put his hood back on. I was just out for a walk. I like walking in the rain. Less people around." He took his glasses off and pulled a corner of his shirt from beneath his slicker to clean them. Curtis' round face was topped by a mass of curly black hair that sprang from beneath his slicker hood like little coils of steel wool. Were you talking to yourself?" Prue froze. "What?" "You were talking to yourself, just back there." He pointed in the direction of the bluff as he squinted and put his glasses back on. "I was sort of following you, I guess. Meant you get your attention early, but you looked so distracted." "I wasn't," was all Prue could think to say. "You were talking to yourself and walking and then stopped," and shaking her head and doing all sort of weird things, she said. And why were you standing on the bluff for so long, just staring into the space? Prue got serious. She walked her bike over to Curtis and pointed to a finger in his face. Listen to me, Curtis, she said, commanding her most intimidating tone. I've got a lot on my mind. I don't need you bothering me right now, okay? To her relief, Curtis appeared to be easily intimidated. He threw up his hands and said, Okay, I was just curious is all. Well, don't be, she said. Just forget everything you saw, all right. She started to push her bike away towards home as she straddled the bike seat and put her feet in the toe clips. She turned to Curtis and said, I'm not crazy, and she rode off. And that is it for chapter 2. I hope you enjoyed, and I'll see you tomorrow. Have a lovely night or day whenever you're listening to this video, and goodbye.